Hi folks, Josh Knight the First here with another episode of Rider Rebuild, coming to you with episode 2 of the series. Let's get right into it. So I did see a lot of the comments from last week, and I guess it's not too early to rebrand, so we're going to go ahead and call this series Rider Rebuild, going ahead and covering episode 2 of this series. So now we had a lot of exposition last week, now we're actually getting into the meat of the story this week. But first, let's go ahead and talk about the opening that we're just seeing for the first time. So as most of you have already heard, the theme is called Be the One by Pandora featuring Beverly. Now here in the opening, we're shown a lot of the visuals that we're going to be seeing over the course of Build. Now the song itself is alright, it's very poppy, it's okay, it's not really catching my ear like last year's Excite did with Daiichi Miura, but it's okay, it's a perfectly serviceable song. The interesting thing I'm seeing about it is actually the timing there in the opening. I feel like everything's just off by a second. Maybe it's just me, but I think I've heard some other people saying this, that the visuals just don't quite match up with what we're seeing on screen. Maybe that's something they'll fix eventually because they'll have to recut it for different forms and different characters, but for right now this is what we're given. Openings aside, let's go ahead and actually talk about the mystery that we're trying to unravel here, namely, why is Ryuga wanted for murder? So the thing that we're learning in this episode is that the murder really is the central point of figuring everything out that we're being given right now. So first off, we see that Sento realizes that because of Ryuga's testimony, as it were, they were both experimented on. He comes to that conclusion very easily, considering they both experienced similar things, provided one of them saw the Batman and the other didn't. Now, as I was saying last week, I was hoping that Sawa, the journalist character, would play a bigger part in the show, and it seems she will. She introduces herself to everybody there in Build HQ, I guess we'll call it that for now, and says that she's willing to do a story on the Kamen Rider, but they tell her they don't want her to. Now, this makes sense that you want to have somebody on the inside. Mind you, there's a kind of comical moment in that she was able to find Build HQ because Soichi left the door open to the headquarters, which is kind of funny and somewhat akin to Alfred just letting Vicky Vale into the Batcave in the original Batman movie. All in all, it's a little bit too convenient, but I get it, we're trying to move things forward. Now, hopefully this doesn't mean that they're going to take shortcuts in storytelling. I just hope that there's a lot to be told here, and they just needed to introduce her a little bit faster. I would have liked a little bit more build-up. Again, not a pun, but I guess we're going to have to deal with what we got. Now, there was something I was talking about last week that I'm actually very happy to see this week, is that we're getting a lot of actual practical bike action. Mind you, we did get a lot of CG, and I'll get into that in a bit, but initially we see Build out trying to track down leads for the Smash, and he's actually chased by these Guardians, these robotic creatures that have been developed by the Institute to go ahead and help track down Build, since Build is now a fugitive. It's interesting to see that the Guardians apparently have onboard cameras, so they can feed back footage of what they're seeing, which is what they eventually use as news footage. The funny thing about it is, I don't know how anybody couldn't have put together that Sento and Build are the same person, when essentially Build goes around the corner and the only person left there is Sento on his phone. I mean, that's not really hard to figure out, he's right there. Now, since we're just starting out this show, you're trying to sell it to its marketable audience, namely kids, so you do want to see an uptick in the comedy quotient. Now here, all of the comedy that we get in the episode isn't as forced as I feel Emu tripping last year was. It feels mostly natural, although it's arguable whether or not one can actually dial a cell phone with their toe. Some people can do it, I can't. But that is to go ahead and get into the bulk of figuring out this mystery of why Ryuga was set up. So we do have it revealed to us that Ryuga was given a tip by his girlfriend or fiance. They don't really specify which, but the ring insists fiance. She's a girl by the name of Kasumi who apparently had an illness, and Ryuga had it in his heart to try and do whatever he could to raise up the money to cure her illness, which is of course a very common trope in Japanese media, in anime. We see this a lot. Point being, she gives him this tip to go ahead and go to this scientist's home where he could potentially have some work for him. Unfortunately, when he gets there, there's already a body, and it's your classic setup case. Now again, this is very simplistic, but I do have to take it with a grain of salt. I have to remember what kind of show I'm watching. Admittedly, yes, it's a little bit more dark than you would expect from years previous, since we're already dealing with one murder, and somebody's gonna end up dead by the end of the episode anyway, but I have to give credit where credit is due. Now here in the middle of the show, we're treated to a lot of action, again, some bike work there with Ryuga being chased by Guardians, but it's interesting to see the different references that are coming up here. The first reference that we see is how the Guardians combine together to make this giant robot. Now the manner in which that's done and the way it's shown on screen seems like a very large throwback to a Bollywood movie called Robot, which was huge over in Bollywood many years ago, was one of the top grossing movies at the time. Some of you may have already seen the most famous scene of the robot and his multiple clones combining together to make different shapes, a snake, a robot, things like that, a giant walking robot, and it seems that they took a page from that book. The other one seems to be the way in which Sento, as Build, works through each problem that he sees there on the battlefield. So the way we're shown it is that he sees the equation for how exactly he's going to achieve victory, this also being one of his catchphrases. The way it comes across visually is akin to, say, in Guy Ritchie's Sherlock Holmes movies, the way Sherlock Holmes works through each of his problems in a fight before he actually executes it, or maybe more familiar to the Lego movie, the way Emmett sees things like a master builder would. Either way, these are both used very effectively to go ahead and get across to the people watching that Sento is very inventive and creative, and that's the kind of character that we want to know he is, so we can cement that early on and then get into more dramatic things later. Now, I didn't talk about this last week, but we'll go ahead and talk about it this week, the idea of Build's form changes. Now, here in the show, Sento refers to them as build-ups. Every time he changes form, whether it's from a best match to something in the middle, he calls out build up. Now, last week we were shown him using the Hedgehog bottle. This week we're shown Gorilla Diamond, or Gorilla Mond as they refer it to. Now, the thing that I'm wondering about is how exactly a best match is determined by his belt, since it seems that he's just kind of doing it at random. Whatever bottles he has on him, he just switches them out. I will say it is interesting to see just exactly how he's able to think through all of the powers that he has at his disposal and then switch them out when he needs to. This shows a more thoughtful process into him actually using the powers that he has available despite how toyetic they are. I can think of an episode back in Kamen Rider O's where there was one episode in particular where Eiji and Ankh, or really not Ankh at the time, were trying to choose different core metals for different situations. They only addressed that once, which was weird since he had so many powers at his disposal, but here, since they're setting that up early, I think that's better for this kind of character. Now, as Ryuga does make his way to the compound where he believes Kasumi is being held against her will, we are introduced fully to Night Rogue, which is this bat-themed combatant. They haven't named him as a rider necessarily, he's referred to as a rival in most of the toy catalog, so that's how we'll refer to him here on the show. So Night Rogue's powers are ill-defined at the moment, although we do see that he's relying on some sort of gas or steam power. We're shown him using two different weapons, a bladed weapon and a projectile weapon. The projectile weapon, we're told by the toy catalogs, is actually what Night Rogue uses to transform, so whoever he is out of that suit, they're using that projectile weapon. And we're shown in short order that Night Rogue has no qualms about making sure that he has everything in his grasp. Sounds kind of familiar with the description I gave somebody else last week. He tells us that there's been this hazard level 1 put on Kasumi, who we now see has been turned into a smash, telling everyone that if she's removed from the smash state, she won't survive, she'll die. Considering that she was already in a weakened state, being sick already, she won't survive the process. Now, I do appreciate it when a villain does know how to be villainous. It goes without saying, but a lot of the times a villain can be very hokey. You can see that in Sentai and some other more silly seasons of Kamen Rider, which I do enjoy, but every so often I just like a good plain old villain. Now, as I was saying, someone else was going to kick the bucket this episode. Unfortunately, it's Kasumi. Now, admittedly, this is very dramatic, very early on in the show, which I actually very much appreciate. The fact that they're going for this early on in just episode 2, and we've already had 2 deaths building up the story. Now, that's not to say I enjoy death so much as I enjoy when there's actual weight on the line, that there's something that the writers are actually fighting for and trying to avenge. This is a theme that goes all the way back to the original Kamen Riders, V3X. They all had family or close people to them that they have to avenge. Now, the idea of this is, of course, like they're screaming it at us, we're setting up Ryuga to be the secondary rider. If it didn't already get across to you, Sento gives him a full bottle made from the remains of Kasumi, which is kind of morbid, that has the motif of a dragon, which makes sense since the Ryu part of Ryuga's name means dragon. They're spelling it out for you, he's going to be Claws. Now, the other interesting thing to take into account is something that we're shown at the very end of the episode, wherein Shoichi is looking at a news article about the Kamen Rider and uses some sort of power to turn the tablet he's looking at into a back scratcher. Now, we have had no hint that he's any sort of powered person up until this point, which might explain a lot. Seeing that his daughter has the capability of purifying the full bottles and making them usable for build, and now Soichi has used this power, now I'm starting to change my theory. Maybe they weren't experimented on, they might be essentially Martians. They might be the ones who are providing build with this technology and equipment. That seems more reasonable than it was last week. Now, whether or not that's true, we're going to have to see. This will all lead into next week's episode when Kasumi gave us a name while dying of a man named Nabeshima, who's the person we see in the flashbacks who set up Ryuga to take the rap for that murder. This is all going to lead into Faust, the mysterious organization that we're seeing here, actually being named on screen. So really, I feel like this was an improvement from last week. Last week was very cut and dry with the exposition. This week, we're actually getting into the meat and potatoes of what the show is going to be. The mystery is unraveling itself slowly, which I like, and we're ramping up to see all of these different things and the weight of what's actually going on. Things seem simple, but if they get more difficult and more expansive, that reminds me more of a series like Gaim, which really took me by surprise and I really enjoyed. So hopefully we'll get that here in Build. But those, of course, were my thoughts on the episode. I want to hear what you guys thought about this episode in the comments below, so let's go ahead and talk about this. First, Misora and Soichi. Do you think that they're Martians, or are they just people that were experimented on by Faust? Secondly, Night Rogue. Who do you think his identity is? Especially given that he saw Sento transform in front of him, he knows who he is, so I imagine we'll find out who he is fairly soon, but who do you think that person's identity is? And lastly, Ryuga. Do you think they're spelling it out a little too hard that he's going to become the secondary writer, or do you appreciate how they're expanding it here in the episode naturally? You tell me. And of course, during the week, you can always talk to me over on social media. On Twitter, I'm at JoshKnight1st. This has been episode 2 of Writer Rebuild for episode 2 of Kamen Rider Build, Innocent Runaway. I'm Josh Knight the First. I'll see you guys again next week.